laptop because it might
sure.
improve the connection. All right, we're gonna try to switch laptops because
for what it's worth, it was fine for me, the audio.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay, it's my end. Let me try breaking off and reattaching. I will be back in a minute.
All right. Okay, but don't join with audio.
Oh, shit.
And make sure your speakers are.
Oh, that sounds better.
That does sound better, yeah.
Thanks for pointing that out, Andrew.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, so sorry, I only know you by Moonfish. Is that how you want to go, or would you prefer a different nomiker?
I'm wondering why there is a separate locks for different controllers. It's just to allow it to run on different copies for these controllers. I mean, running in different binaries.
Yeah, there will be different binaries for the KCM and CCM.
Yeah.
So these controllers migrate one by one instead of together.
Well,
it allows us. It'll allow us. So there's the case. You will always run the KCM, right? Or at least I'm guessing you'll always run the KCM. It's actually up to you. But most of us will always run the KCM. And then we'll add the CCM as well as a separate binary. And so the KCM is responsible for running all controllers that don't need a cloud provider implementation. The CCM is responsible for running all controllers that do need a cloud provider implementation.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then because today the KCM has a cloud provider implementation, but we're removing it, there are a set of controllers that need to move from the KCM to the CCM. And is this
I think
a beautiful picture?
Yeah. So I think what a good thing would be, because we kind of like, once this didn't make the 116 KEP deadline, kind of put this in the back burner. So I think a good thing to do would be to go through what we have in the KEP and see what details we're missing and if what we have in the KEP is still what we want.
Yep.
Okay, so why don't I just do a brain dump of what my understanding of what we agreed on, and then Walter, you can let me know if there's anything we changed. So my understanding was that we're gonna have some sort of library or framework where you can specify, it's sort of like arbitrary locks, but not really. It's a bit more, it has like more stricter requirements, but essentially like, for example, like the AWS cloud provider can say like, I want this lock with some name, and it's gonna have these controllers in it, and you specify what component in each respective version of Kubernetes would run that lock, right? So you would say like in 117, I want like service and route controller to run in the Cloud Controller Manager. Oh, sorry. You would say in 117, I want service route controller to run in the KCM, the Kube Controller Manager. But then in 118, I want the service route controller running in the Cloud Controller Manager, right? And so as you flip the version and all the components just know how to coordinate between the two by switching where the controller runs. And so I think the things we agreed on is like the lock that so the lock is specified on a per provider basis. So the library is, we have a library, but then the provider would specify in some Go file or something that says, like there would be maybe there'd be a file only for AWS, and then you can decide as AWS maintainers like what locks you want per version, and then what controllers you want under each lock. So like what most providers will probably do is they'll have just one lock that migrates all the controllers, but some providers may want to do in smaller steps. So they may want just the node controllers in one lock and just the network controllers in one lock, and then is something else another?
So if I can interrupt briefly, this is really important for two reasons. The first is it may be true that Amazon wants to migrate to the CCM in going from 120 to 121, but Azure wants to migrate do that same migration, but they want to do it as they go from 121 to 122. So the first thing you get is the ability to determine when you want to do the migration, depending on your local realities. The other thing is that we know there are certain controllers, like the Node IPAM controller, where Google runs its own custom version of the Node IPAM controller in the KCM. When I say that, basically what I'm saying is our version of the Node IPAM controller uses the cloud provider and no one else's does. So it makes sense for us to want to move it to the CCM, whereas what everyone else is going to want to do is just remove the cloud provider reference from the Node IPAM controller.
Right,
Yep.
but this allows us to, if other providers decide to take specific controllers and turn them into cloud-specific things, then they can do that, and they can do it at any version that they want to.
Exactly.
It's a pretty powerful
Yep.
action there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no worries. I'm glad you stopped to clarify there. One thing to clarify though is that each lock you specify is a new leader election lock resource, which obviously takes performance out of the API server and whatnot. And so obviously you don't want to do like one lock per controller, which adds up. So if you're doing like the full migration over time, you're going to end up adding 5 extra watches for locks. So you want to do it within like 2 or 3 locks max, right?
Yeah, I mean, I will point out that both we and I think IBM have done analysis that shows that somewhere between 10 and 20% of all etcd and Kube API server traffic is just handling leader election. So it is not an insignificant cost.
Yeah. And you don't want to have the migration locks for for a lot of versions. Like you want to do the switch quickly in one version, and then the next version delete the lock, right?
Well, yeah, it's introduce the lock, migrate on the next version, delete the lock on the third version, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So all you, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through if I missed any details from last time. I don't think so. I think that's where we ended, right? There was some requirements I wrote down about. Right.
Well,
so the properties of the migration lock are must have a unique name. The set of controllers in the lock is immutable. So if you do a release specifying the lock, you can't change what controllers are in the lock in the next version. No two migration locks can have overlapping controllers. The controller manager where the lock runs can change across versions. So what this means is when you specify lock and you say like on 117, I'm doing these and I'm doing these controllers and in the Kube controller manager, like the only thing you're allowed to change about that lock is what component you're switching to. And ideally you don't have to, you're not gonna switch back to the Kube controller manager, right? And then for a minor release, it should run exclusively either in the KCM or the CCM.
Can I add 2 things to that? One is an is a implication, but I think it's good to spell it out. Not only for a minor release should you run exclusively in one type of controller, one type of controller manager, but the lock needs to be held. If you hold the lock in a minor release, all versions of that minor release should hold the lock.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, sorry, it's a subtlety. So that last point, for a minor release, it should run exclusively in one type of controller manager, which I completely agree with. But I think it's also worth mentioning that all versions of that minor release, which is like, you should hold the lock, right? And the reason that that's true is then my other point, which is that this migration mechanism should work for both upgrades and downgrades.
Okay, so in other words, the migration lock shouldn't change in any way across patch releases.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I also think we need to specify that the migration lock should work for both upgrades and downgrades.
Yes, yeah.
And that one implication to make that work is that we do assume that you will go through every minor release in a chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you're not gonna skip like 117 to 19 or something like that.
Or 119 back to 117 is the one I'm really concerned about, but yes.
Who does that? Like, I've never heard that. Okay, so Nick, Yang, you seen any questions or
Yeah,
even like, do you want to change anything here?
I have it's more of a question. Do we have any like minimum of set of releases that we should have for this migration path? If I understand correctly, this will span across 3 releases at least.
So I think you introduce the migration lock in version A.
Mm-hmm.
You migrate to the CCM in version A+1, and then you can, in minor release A+1, and then you can delete the lock in release A+2.
Okay.
But it does mean that if you want to go to CCM in 118, it means you have to have, at the beginning of 117, introduced the lock. Because all your 117s must have it if you're going to do it safely.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand the point about the multiple migration locks. So you have the set of controllers that are staying in the KCM. Those use the KCM lock. You have the set of controllers that are potentially in the CCM. Those use a CCM lock, and the migration lock only applies to the ones that are transitioning. So what is the case where you need two migration locks again? Can you just re-explain that?
So
I don't think do you want me to do it, Andrew, or do you want to do it?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
So there are a couple. Let me take a real world example that Google has. I run, and IBM I know does as well. I run 4 controller managers today.
Okay.
So one of the things I want to do is not only, I want to migrate things from the KCM to the CCM and make sure that works. And then I want to start pulling stuff into the CCM from some of my other controllers.
Okay.
There is also the possibility, another real world example, how familiar are you with all the controllers that run in the KCM?
Somewhat.
Okay. There are some, let us say there are some root level controllers that run in the KCM, right?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, there's a controller whose job is to determine what rights and privileges a controller has.
Right.
I do not believe that should be running in the same controller manager as all of the lesser privileged controllers, because if you can somehow gain access through some sort of privilege escalation to that controller, you can then give yourself any rights you want in the system. So I envision that at some point SIG or someone else is going to suggest that we break the KCM into multiple controllers that are not about cloud provider. And so we're sort of looking forward, as we think this is a reusable feature, that we're going to be using it again for other controller migrations. And so you could certainly, if we convince people, hey, these 3 controllers have escalated privileges and should be run in their own escalated privilege controller manager, that you could certainly see one where in version 120 to 121, I moved from KCM to CCM for one set of stuff. And then in 121 to 122, I move another set of controllers into the escalated privilege controller.
Mhm.
So that's really more what this is about. But also the other use cases, I mentioned that we do special things for Node IPAM controller so that we have finer grained control of what IP spaces our customer nodes have. I'm entirely willing to believe that Amazon is going to want the same feature at some point in the future. So even if you don't want it when you do the original KCM to CCM migration, it is entirely possible that you're going to later decide to do the same things that we do, and then you're going to want to migrate the Node IPAM controller from the KCM to the CCM.
Right.
Does that make sense?
So yeah, no, that makes sense. But just to be extra clear, so that would we would only need the extra lock if we wanted to do two of those migrations at this within the same version upgrade, right? Like
well, in theory, you need one lock. So you always need a KCM lock.
Well, 3 total, but 1 migration lock, I guess.
Well, and let me finish, and I think we're saying the same thing, but I want to be, since it's being recorded and other people may come, I want to be very clear.
Sure.
We need 1 KCM lock, we need 1 CCM lock, and then we need a lock for every set of controllers that are being migrated between versions A and A+1.
Right, but specifically the same binary to the same binary. Like they're going from the same place to the same, So
different binaries, right? So from KCM to CCM or
what KCM. I mean, they all are going from the same binary, which is binary A, to the same binary B, not from multiple sources to the same destination or from the same source to multiple destinations.
Yes. The set of controllers have to be doing the same binary A to binary B migration. If they're going between different binaries, they need a different lock. Yes.
I have another question. Does this imply that there's a specific order for upgrades?
That'd be based on what, like the leader election lock that you as a cloud provider specify. So like if the first lock on 117, you're saying that I want like all the node controllers, then that's the order that you're going to migrate. But I think 80% of the providers are just going to do like, I'm going to do 1 lock that migrates all of them. And like, that's the end of the story for that. But we wanted to leave the option open in case either provider, like pretty much everything Walter said, but also adding the case where a provider might think migrating all the controllers at once is too risky. So they want to do like 1 controller or 2 controllers at a time. So they can kind of vet out the process and have it, test it without kind of blowing everything up.
Okay.
Yep. I agree with that. The other thing I will mention is, I don't know if it's exactly what you're asking, but one of the reasons why I would like the lock to remain the same for an entire point release is so that it doesn't matter what patch you're on. So you don't have to migrate from patch 117. If I want to downgrade, I don't have to go from 117.2 to 117.1 to 116.9 to 116.7, right? If the lock is good on all of 116 and all of 117, then I should be able to safely downgrade from any patch release of 117 to any patch release of 116.
Yeah.
And by the way, a small question. Is there any dependency between controllers? I mean, for this to work, every controller should be independent from each other. I mean,
the lock is the only dependency, right? So to migrate from 116 KCM to 117 CCM, 116 KCM needs to be holding the same migration lock as 117 CCM. And that should be, the whole point of this is to make that the only dependency.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether there is some, implicit dependency that rely on the controllers is running in same binaries. I don't think there should be.
No, there shouldn't be.
I mean, like one other thing that could be a concern is like if you have different versions of the controllers across the two binaries, then that could cause some issues. But that's kind of going back to yesterday's convo, like that's why we have the legacy cloud provider repo, so that whatever you build into your CCM is the same provider. Or if you deviate, at least you should be aware that, you know, if you're going to change the controller version, that they're compatible between the two.
So I agree with that, but I'm going to make the odd argument that that is no different than if the controller didn't move. Like if I move from 116 to 117 and the controller changes, I mean, the fact that it migrated and changed, you know, or the fact that it changed and migrated, it's the fact that it changed, and whether it migrated or not is sort of
okay.
What you're saying is
That's a good
that it's changing every version anyway, so
yeah. Okay, that's a good point.
So it is a concern. I don't think, however, it is a migration-specific concern.
Okay.
Will we end up at some point using the library in the KCM and the CCM too?
Which library?
The library that will generate the locks.
Oh, I would assume so. Yeah, they should be. I would hope that they're both. I mean, the library, by the way, I believe is just the client Go library.
We're using the
well,
the
it would.
one?
So I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like
Yeah,
the client Go library is what gives us the actual locking mechanism, but we need to wrap it a little bit so that we can say we have flags or something that returns like what controller runs in what component, and if I'm on that component, then I need to add these controllers into the main lock or not, things like that.
Yeah, that's true. I agree. Yeah, so the client Go is the actual lock, and then we'll provide some helper utilities that should normalize how we do, you know, read the config, etc.
Yeah. So for the user experience, do we envision the configuration via config file, right?
So it wouldn't be any config file. Like so essentially what's happening is like the config for the leader election happens inside of both the KCM and the CCM, and the providers are building it into both binaries. And so like the migration is forced depending on the changes you make into the binaries on that version.
So quick question on that, Andrew. It's easy enough for any cloud provider to build their own custom CCM. I'm a little concerned about people having to build their own custom KCM. Are we sure this isn't something that would be better done as like config, be it a YAML or whatever?
What do you mean by building their own CCM? Oh, sorry, building their own KCM.
Well, so if we do it as a .go file, right, then I actually have, then whoever's shipping, I mean, for me, it's no big deal. We do that anyway. But
yeah.
I would imagine there are a lot of cloud providers out there who just take the KCM binary that is built by, you know, the CNCF release team and just use the KCM binary as is. And so if we're going to say, oh, you've got to add this Go file and then recompile.
But it's only applicable to the entry cloud providers, right? So like we're only adding migration locks in the KCM. Like the migration lock for KCM is only enabled if you're already in an entry cloud provider that needs to be migrated out of tree.
Right. I agree with that, but I mean, that doesn't change the fact that, you know, well, I mean, so one, I can certainly see uses for out of tree providers. I mean, Red Hat, as an example, will happily use this, and they're not an entry. I don't think they're an entry cloud provider. In addition, I don't know. I mean, if we could, it's much easier to drop a YAML file and read it and then try to use it as a config than it is to drop in a Go file and have to recompile the KCM.
Yeah, I agree. But the main issue that we might face with this is mostly around the API. So I'm not sure if we're still extending and adding flags.
Yeah, like I'm confused about like the add a tree case, because the way I see it is like if you're already in tree, then adding this migration library for that entry provider is like there's no real. Obviously, we're adding more complexity, but like.
Oh, I get it. Sorry, I misunderstood. So when you say adding a Go file, you're actually saying you're going to add it to the cloud provider.
Yeah, like.
Okay.
Yeah, like
Right.
we're sorry. What I mean is like we're gonna add a new package somewhere, and then the KCM is gonna call that package if it matches your cloud provider that you're running, pretty much.
That's fine.
The
by
only
me.
problem I see with that then is long term. You can't use this once you're out of tree, right?
You can't use it once you're out of tree.
But the CCM will require it, right? I mean, there's
So if I take the Node IPAM example, right? So I'm Amazon. Thanks for letting me join your team, Nick. So I'm Amazon, and I have a Node IPAM controller, and I'm in the beautiful world. I've migrated everything to CCM, but the Node IPAM controller is still in my KCM. And I suddenly discover that my customers want to be able, or maybe not my customers, I want to be able to allow some central Amazon system to control the IP addresses of the cluster.
Mhm.
And so I'm going to switch to the Node IPAM controller to start making cloud provider calls, which means I have to migrate the Node IPAM controller out of the KCM and into the CCM.
Okay.
But I no longer have a cloud provider in my KCM.
So if you're at that point where like nothing in the KCM is making the cloud calls, but you have stuff in the CCM, then the solution would be to actually just add it directly in the CCM. And in the same version you add it in the CCM, you turn it off in the KCM.
Yeah, but I've still got to migrate between the two versions. And then I'm back to having a migration problem where I have the Node IPAM controller in 122 in the KCM, and 123 it's in the CCM, and this migration mechanism no longer works for me because I can't set up the migration lock in the KCM because I don't have a cloud provider in the KCM.
So the point here is just whether or not this package that supports these locks is included in the KCM.
Well, so just to be clear, I mean, I'm looking fairly far down the road, and maybe just not a problem we want to worry about now. But the idea that, and there's a lot of nice things to it. The idea that Andrew's pushing is that we need to configure the locks, and we need to configure the locks on a per cloud provider basis. And since we're doing it on a per cloud provider basis, he's actually yeah, that is also true, but the specific thing right now is that it's being done per cloud provider, right?
Yep.
It's also being done per version, so it's sort of per version per cloud provider. But the thing I'm looking at right now is the per cloud provider.
Yep.
Since it's per cloud provider, his idea is why not just put it in the cloud provider interface, and that way you just make a cloud provider call and say, I'm version X. Hey, my cloud provider implementation, I'm version X, which locks should I be holding? And I process foo, which locks should I be holding?
Yeah,
and
that's
right.
Yeah, and that's fixed. Like it doesn't matter. You can't not configure it. Like if you have cloud provider AWS enabled on that version we specify, like you have to run that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nice things to that. I mean, maybe it's not worth worrying about, but I would say as a caveat, when we get far enough down the road, it does mean that this mechanism doesn't work for any binary that doesn't link in the cloud provider.
Yeah, and like
So I think one thing that you said that I don't agree with is having it in the cloud provider interface. Like that's why earlier I said some library or framework. Like I don't think it needs to be directly tied into the cloud provider at all. But like there would be some call in the like somewhere in CMD/Kube controller manager, like you're still checking, you're calling that library and you're checking your component name and what version you are. And then you decide, and then you pull in from that, like what controllers that we classify as cloud controllers in or out of whatever lock you want.
but like if we do this, would this limit us in terms of controller that will be migrating?
What do you mean by that? Like
if we want to start migrating some other controllers, like some entry ones, if you want to break the different control loops into separate binaries, wouldn't we be able to reuse this feature?
Yeah, you could. You'd have to probably rework it a little bit to be broader, but I think the idea, the concept's the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest concern then is we can say that it's not the cloud provider implementation or interface, but for all intents and purposes, we're just creating a second cloud provider interface or implementation that is specifically for migration, right? And then we're going to come back to the, okay, who's allowed to make changes? Like, is VMware, is Rancher, is et al. Allowed to make changes in there?
Yeah, that's a good point. Look, I don't think I think we should look at this in the angle of, like, we have a specific use case, which is migrating the cloud controllers, and we should build it with that use case in mind and not, but we should keep extensibility in mind, but we shouldn't make it the primary goal, because then I feel like we're trying to account for all these use cases that aren't a reality yet. And so like, I'd like to build something that like works well for this case, and we can take the general concept and repurpose it for other things, but not directly build it for general use case yet.
Yeah, and I think like the solution that you proposed, Andrew, doesn't restrict us. If we want to reuse this for a broader usage, we can always add the config file flag and just reuse it.
In fact, I kind of what I'm going to play off of what Yassine just said. In fact, if we do this, we could even just at some point build a implementation of that interface, which is the thing that reads the config file and returns based on that. So I don't think we're even particularly closing ourselves out. So I mean, we can start here, and if we have time, we can even build the config file version.
So for the initial migration, all of the config will be compiled into the binaries, and then we'll leave the door open for non-compiled lock config later down the line. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's what we're saying. Thank you, Yassine. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so next steps. So who wants to go through the CAP and kind of refine it and add whatever details we just talked about that's not in the CAP yet?
I can do that.
Okay, so
Awesome.
the CAP deadline is the 15th, right? So that's going to come up pretty fast. So how about, do you all feel okay with having the extraction migration subproject on a weekly basis just until the CAP deadline hits? Just so we have a bit more, a faster cadence on this.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
So Yassine, how about by Thursday, we have the whatever CAP changes done by then, or at least like the PR open so we can review.
Okay, fine by me.
Okay.
I'll let you guys, I'm happy to review. I need to be working on network proxy to beta CAP, because that also needs to hit for the 15th.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
And then Mike Kreutz is supposed to have been working on the what was it? The credential
credential.
provider?
Yeah.
Andrew, did you talk to him about that? I think you mentioned that you were going to reach out.
Yeah. So I did. I mean, we spoke briefly, and he expressed interest. And I thought he was going to be in yesterday's meeting, but he wasn't there. So let me poke him again.
Okay.
But if he can't take it, is that something that you're all interested in working on?
So
The credential provider is it's like the Docker queuing provider.
right,
Kubelet.
and for Kubelet, right? 15th, so that gives us 2 weeks. Yeah, I think if he can't do it, then we can find resources here for it. So if you could just get back to us as soon as possible on that, so we can make sure that.
Yeah, let me poke him today.
Okay, thank you.
Well, the other thing I would like on that one, I mean, let's talk goal and fallback. I think the goal would be to get something approved for alpha. But at a minimum, I want to make sure, unless it's already been done, I want to make sure that we at least have the KEP proposal, where KEP proposal means that we have an agreed upon problem that needs to be fixed, even if we don't have the agreement on how we fix it. So that's the fallback. I mean, the goal would be we have an agreement on how we want to approach alpha.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And if you need help reaching out to the Node team on that one, please let me know. I'm actually dealing with the Node team quite a bit right now, and may be able to get a little bit of traction getting a Node review. And I'm guessing right now, given certain things, that you're going to have a hard time getting anyone else to get you that.
Okay. Yeah, I think ideally, Andrew, like if we could know that we're taking this work by, like Monday or Tuesday next week, that would be.
Yeah, I'll ping Mike right after this meeting, and I'll see if I can get an answer out of him today.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.